You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast, where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I'm answering a question from Danielle in Georgia. Danielle has emailed before, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting her at the Atlanta meetup a couple of months ago. So good to hear from you again, Danielle. And this is about a child's play specifically and what's going on in a play session and trying to kind of unpack it in light of presenting concerns and history, just kind of trying to make sense of what's going on. Now, my disclaimer before we dive into this and before I read parts of the email is we do not always have to understand what the child is playing, why they're playing it. We don't have to be able to recognize themes. We don't have to identify symbolic play. We don't even need to know the history and the background of the child. And Landreth actually talks about how that can convolute the process. So sometimes it is more helpful for us not to know what is going on, not to know the history, because then we make leaps and connections that aren't actually there. So with all that said, I'm going to read parts of Danielle's email. We'll dive into, this is a little bit of a case consult, I guess. But let's be really clear. We do not need to know why. We do not need to connect play to experience. We do not need to be able to recognize themes. CCPT works when we are CCPT. And we don't have to take it any further than adherence to the model. The child knows what he needs to work on. We stay out of his way. We remain adherent, and he will work through the things that he needs to. But I still think it'll be helpful to kind of unpack this together. So thank you so much for the email, Danielle. And so actually, I'm going to tell you a story really quickly. So when I was at the meetup, she said to me, "You talk fast in real life, but I always set your speed to 1.5 or 1.75 or 2. I don't remember what number she told me, but I always set the speed on the podcast episodes faster. So I feel like you're talking so slowly right now." And so many people tell me that they put me on a higher speed, which is crazy. I guess y'all can be grateful that I have a low speaking voice, because if I had a high speaking voice and then you made me faster, I think I would just squeak. So I'm glad that I have the tone of voice that allows you to speed me up and I don't sound as much like a chipmunk as I think I would. Anyway, so she says in her email, "I can confirm you do not talk as fast as I have your podcast speed set to." So I'm so glad that you all are able to binge listen by speeding me up, and you can get like 2 in the same amount of time as 1 if you don't speed me up. So I'm glad technology allows you to binge listen the way that y'all do. Okay. So she says, "I want to take a moment to say how grateful I am that you recently covered room wrecking in one of your episodes. I've been working with a child, and your strategy to help kids get unstuck has already been so helpful, but I have a few deeper questions." So this child is 6. His father passed away. He, in 8 to 10 or so sessions, has room wrecked, scattering them across the room. And she implemented he's been stuck, so he's going, if he chooses to room wreck, he chooses to help clean up. And she said, he does room wreck, but he will help me clean up. He often tests his own abilities, and sometimes limits are put into place for those. He initially struggled with limits, but now typically abides when limits are set. That's huge. And then sensory seeking. He rubs sand all over himself, seems calm when doing so, and bounces on the ball, yoga ball, big exercise ball. And then teachers report no aggressive or destructive behaviors, but have seen withdrawal and disinterest. Okay. So, question. With the complexity of his grief and strong attachment to his dad, what do you make of his sensory-seeking, risk-taking, and room-wrecking behaviors? I adhere to CCPT principles. He seems to have formed a healthy attachment with me. I never feel in danger or threatened by his behaviors. It's almost eerie because I feel like I should at times, but I'm just in it with him, feeling as if I know this is the best place for him to show these behaviors. I would love any insights you have on how these behaviors may relate to his trauma and grief processing. Okay, so I think it would be more helpful to not think of this in terms of how this relates to his grief and trauma. I think we need to just look at the behaviors one at a time and just identify what's likely at the root. So Room wrecking, we know that that is usually rooted in I need to externalize and show outwardly what's going on inwardly. And my internal state is so chaotic and messy that I need to create that in the playroom. Now, in less frequent cases, it's highly anxious kids and they're so tightly wound that they just finally have to let it all out. So they will room wreck like once as a release. This child, 8 to 10 sessions in a row, I suspect that is demonstration of what's going on inside. When kids room wreck, it is an outward expression of what's going on internally, more often than not. This is how chaotic and messy and overwhelming I feel. So I'm trying to represent that in the playroom. That makes sense. He's 6. He's young. His father died at 5. He is trying to deal with a new reality, a new normal, and yes, grief and loss and trauma and all of these things. So I think that is likely why he's room wrecking. The fact that he initially struggled with responding to limits, but now abides when limits are set, that's evidence of self-control. That's evidence of self-regulation. That is a huge moment. When a child is finally able to comply, it shows that they are in fact able to be aware of their behavior and regulate accordingly. That's a huge win in the playroom. Okay, risk-taking play. Almost always, and I'm going out on a limb here, Danielle, because you didn't say this, but it seems as though associated with a lot of what you're saying is high levels of anxiety. And that would make a whole lot of sense because when a child's world feels completely out of control and completely powerless, it almost always emerges in huge levels of anxiety. Because when you are 5 years old and something overwhelming like a death of a parent takes place, your brain starts going, what else could happen? What if this? Oh no, this could be so bad. What if this happened? What would it mean if this? Now all of a sudden you're spiraling with huge levels of anxiety, especially if you don't have an emotional vocabulary. So I suspect that he probably is highly anxious. And when you see risk-taking, I typically categorize that as fear-facing play. But when you see risk-taking behavior, standing on chairs, jumping over obstacles, tasting markers and glue, poking himself with pipe cleaners. Okay. First of all, you said all of which limits are put in place and sometimes those items are removed if he continues to test those limits. Let me unpack that for a second. Standing on chairs, I personally would never set a limit on a child standing on a chair. Jumping over obstacles, I would never set a limit on jumping over obstacles unless it was from 5 feet in the air and there's actually a concern of him getting hurt. Tasting markers and glue, I would probably very pseudo limit set that. Like, oh, you're touching your tongue to that, but you know glue isn't for putting in your mouth. And I would just leave it there unless the child continues to persist. Poking himself with art tools, unless he's poking himself hard enough that he's actually getting injured. Like if it's scratching or drawing blood, then sure, absolutely. But Danielle, what you're describing, I would not set limits on any of that fully. I would pseudo limit the glue, but the rest of it, I would just say, oh, you're choosing to stand on the chair. Oh, you decided to jump over that obstacle. So I'm not sure if this is truly dangerous enough to, if it is, then you're absolutely adherent in setting the limit. You have to be safe. He has to be safe. Things can't be damaged or broken. So if he is doing something that is dangerous and his safety is a concern, yes, limit set. I'm not sure that I would without more context. So just wanted to throw that out there. But often kids who are highly anxious, they need to face their fears. So if standing on a chair is scary to him, even if he doesn't want to admit it, if jumping over obstacles is scary to him, even though he doesn't want to admit it, there are elements of I'm trying to conquer some of this anxiety. You also sometimes just have dysregulated behavior and they just can't control. They don't even realize that what they're doing is out of control. It's just their expression of how they feel. So it could be maybe both, could be some fear facing and just, I have no control over this. And so I'm just doing whatever on a whim comes into my brain. Either way, I don't know that that requires limits unless it meets criteria that we already discussed. And then the sensory seeking. That sounds to me, bouncing on the ball and rubbing sand, that sounds like self-soothing. Again, comorbid with high levels of anxiety. So we will often see kids do self-soothing, ritualistic kind of repetitive play like that, especially sensory, because it's calming, it's grounding, it's stabilizing, and it's soothing. So I suspect that is related to calming down the big feelings, specifically the worry and anxiety. And then no aggressive or destructive behaviors at school, but withdrawal and disinterest in schoolwork. Well, remember, the brain has a hierarchy and it can only attend to so much at once. So when we have grief and loss, as well as therapy, there's no way this child has bandwidth to do math. And school and interest in school and completion of homework is almost always the first sign that a child does not have the capacity to attend to that right now. When kids are emotionally overwhelmed, when they're mentally overwhelmed, when they're psychologically overwhelmed, when they're socially overwhelmed, relationally overwhelmed, you name it, school is almost always the first fallout. Because let's face it, if you're dealing with the grief of losing your dad, do you really want to sit down and do spelling work? If you're right in the middle of your junk in play therapy, do you really have the bandwidth to want to study for your geography test? There's just a prioritization of mental capacity. Kids are not cognitive. They're not rational. They're not going to process things intellectually. Math requires all of that. So emotions are always going to trump that. He's able to regulate in the school environment, but he doesn't really want to do school. And that's understandable based on everything that's going on emotionally and psychologically for him. So Danielle, thank you so much for your question. I hope that that's helpful to everyone. And, we have these cases where we know what's going on history-wise. We know the experiences that have brought the child to the playroom. And sometimes we're trying to figure out how things tie together, but I often find it's more helpful to just look at root cause of the behavior. Not it's tied to this, but, this behavior is almost always associated with this issue. And so that is usually the way that you can kind of get around the unknown of making some of those connections. All right, y'all. I love you. Thanks for hanging out with me. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.